of the modeling and policy development for the 2023 Regional Transportation Plan. I know from personal experience that modeling can feel like a black box, and we want to open that box. We want to invite everyone in so we can learn together and advance our practices collaboratively and as a metro region. And Metro is also doing this work in a statewide context of being accountable to the climate impact and climate state goals. And in March of 2020, Governor Brown issued an executive order directing state agencies to reduce climate pollution even further. So I'm anxious to get into our discussion, but before we do that, I'm going to go over the agenda and some ground rules. So first on the agenda, Metro Councilor Juan Carlos Gonzalez is going to provide opening thoughts about the importance of this work to the greater Portland region. Then we'll have our esteemed panelists introduce themselves and get a little background on their current work. And then before we move into discussion, Metro staff will briefly present and provide an overview about the region's climate smart strategies and Metro's modeling efforts to date. After that, we'll move into our expert panel discussion, which I will facilitate. And then we're going to take a break, a very short break at 9 o'clock. When we come back from our break, we're going to bring up Metro Council and JPAC members who are here and ask them for their questions and thoughts. In the interest of time, we will not be taking questions from public or attendees today, only from Metro Council, JPAC members, and from our panelists. And I apologize for that, but we have to facilitate the conversation in a way that we hear mostly from our panelists, but we appreciate everyone being here in the audience. In terms of the panelists, I'm hoping that one person speaks at a time. It's harder to do over Zoom, but we'll work at that. And I'm hoping that we hear from all of our panelists. Even though we have a big panel, I will do my best to make sure that everyone has an opportunity to speak. And for no further ado, before I introduce the panelists, I'm going to let Councilor Gonzalez kick off his remarks. So Councilor Gonzalez.
Thank you so much, Margie. Buenos dias. Good morning to everyone. It's amazing that we have over 100 attendees to hear and learn and engage on this really important subject matter. Really appreciate the expert panelists for being here, taking the time to talk with us today. And of course, Metro councilors, JPAC members, and elected leaders from across Greater Portland. Climate leadership is a topic that I'm very passionate about, something that's close to my heart, and something that I know is really important to a lot of other folks as they engage with the RTP. In Oregon, we know that transportation is the largest contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Addressing climate change is paramount to ensuring our region can thrive in the future and is livable for everyone, including the communities that are hardest hit by the impacts of climate change, people of color, and people with low incomes. Transportation is a key focus at Metro as Oregon and Greater Portland region increase our efforts to address climate change. And as we know, with this update of the RTP, the Regional Transportation Plan, it outlines all the major transportation investments for the next 25 years. So it's a document that we take seriously, and I think is an important guiding light for our work. The 2023 RTP is an opportunity to identify achievable actions to address the climate impacts of transportation. Our climate modeling work is a cornerstone. Greater Portland has a history of collaboration and innovation that has made this region a thought leader on climate. And the RTP is our opportunity to once again show how we can work together to address the urgent issues in front of us today. Thank you again to everyone for tuning in. And I know I'm really excited for the conversation. Back to you, Margie.
Thank you. Okay, so we're going to kick off. Each panelist is going to do an introduction and a short overview of what they're working on. I'm going to kick it off with our colleagues or friends from Colorado DOT. And we've actually got two on our panel today since Director Liu, Shoshana Liu, has to leave early. And I'll let you kind of co-present with Rebecca White if that's what you would like to do, who's also from Colorado DOT.
That would be great. Can we promote Eric Sabina to a panelist too? We have our lead modeler on and want to make sure that you all can hear from him directly.
He's not on yet.
Yeah, we're watching for him. He's not.
He is on.
Is he on?
Yes, he's on.
somebody else's name or is somebody else registered for him? His name is not showing up in the list.
He may have used my link.
Okay.
So in an interest of time, why don't we have staff continue to work on this in the background and you do your intros and we'll figure out where Eric is. Okay.
That sounds great.
Okay, thank you.
Well, I can start and I'll be able to stick around for a little while and you have sort of the dream team here. I want to talk a little bit about where our policy came from and then how we've been going about implementing it in the year and change since we've been working on this really important initiative that's been quite transformational in the policy conversation in Colorado. The kind of impetus for our rulemaking that was completed by the Colorado Transportation Commission last year came from a requirement in our state transportation bill that was signed a little over a year ago, Senate Bill 260, which really focused on combining traditional investment and getting our road and bridge program done faster, with taking very seriously the fact that we need to invest more sustainably in transportation and kind of broaden the way we think about it and make sure that when we build those bigger projects in particular, we're doing so in a way that is kind of reflective of that goal and that set of values in totality. The bill kind of writ large tasked the kind of state commissions and staff to put in place requirements for projects of regional significance in the way that we look at specifically greenhouse gas emissions and also including a mention of vehicular miles traveled. Essentially, what it was asking us to do was put in place a serious policy that considered the reality of induced demand on bigger projects and that set a framework for thinking about how the choices that we make with space in the built environment impact the way that people move. After some kind of working through of where this sat in the policy process, and it was actually an interesting conversation because historically there isn't something like this. So figuring out how you could get it done and regulated was something that required a lot of work between multiple commissions and multiple agencies. It was determined that the Colorado Transportation Commission would implement the policy with support from the staff at the Colorado Department of Transportation and working together with stakeholders from across the state. I mentioned that because the way that we got this done, was very intricate and required just a lot of conversation with people in every corner of the state, including those who thought that this was a great idea and those who thought that this was a terrible idea, and everywhere in between. And, I would say for anyone thinking about how to do these things, that having a big tent of who you talk to, even with the people who are never going to come along liking it, is really, really important. And, even now, as we're working through what it means in real time, I would say that we spend as much time kind of talking amicably with people who might at some point challenge aspects of the rule as we do with the people who think it's a wonderful change in policy. And that's something that is, hard, but is resulting in a kind of more mindful process that's inclusive in a state that's very diverse, which I know is what many of you deal with in your region as well. In the formal rulemaking process, we held 10 public meetings in person and virtual, but that was only sort of the tip of the iceberg. We also have had a kind of conglomeration of working groups, since well before the rule was put in place, that started with kind of a kitchen cabinet of people from different vantage points and has sort of morphed into a more technical group that's really working together on refining the modeling. And that's why it's so important that you hear directly from our modelers today. And, that has really been part of a process where balancing, coming up with the policy and figuring out how you're going to actually do it has been something that we've worked on throughout. And, I think one of the benefits of having the implementing agency be the one with the most direct subject matter expertise is that it's much more sort of tactical in realizing what the things that are easy, hard, possible, and impossible will be. And, there are certainly downsides to having the agency that does it be the agency that writes the policy. But, it has also, I think, made it much more manageable for the community of practice in the transportation space. So, I think that on balance, having the regulators be very knowledgeable of the details of what the implementers are doing is something that is irreplaceable in changing paradigm as much as our policies here do. to talk a little bit just at the high level about what our Colorado rule does, and again, with lots of opportunity to get into the specific mechanics, and this is quite the group to be able to have that conversation. Quite an interstate dream team of technical experts here. It's kind of humbling to be in your presence. And the kind of general parameter of the rule, for those of you who know conformity policy, is that we tried to create a framework that looked a lot like conformity in the ozone space, but was for greenhouse gas pollution in the infrastructure space. And a general premise that we used is that in creating something new, taking as many elements that look like things people have done already as possible was really important for it to be able to sink in. So the kind of, it looks in its kind of infrastructure like ozone conformity, in that each complying agency gets a target. You have a couple chances to hit the target. If you don't, the kind of consequences, you can either go back and change what's in the plan, or there's a framework for adding mitigations. It includes all of the MPOs in Colorado, as well as the state, which is essentially the Colorado Department of Transportation. And we sort of split up the parts of the statewide budget so that everybody gets a share for which they're responsible. And there's a little bit of interoperability between the complying agencies, because the MPO areas are somewhat reliant on what CDOT does, and CDOT is somewhat reliant on what the MPO agencies do. And we all have to sort of work together. And that again was figuring out which kind of logistical complexities made sense. And we decided that all jumping into the water together was probably better than trying to parse it out in other ways, but that's something that we're working through, and you'll hear more from later. And within each area, there's some different timelines, so that the non-attainment areas and CDOT have to comply first, and then the kind of more rural MPOs in the state have a little bit more time to comply, in part because the capacity building needs amongst staff are more so. Thinking about what the mitigations will be has been a very interesting process that we're going through kind of iteratively. But one of the things that I think has been an immediate impact of this is that it started a conversation about what mitigation looks like, so that in practicality, these kinds of improvements are getting applied to projects long before they had to. Like the major projects that the state is doing right now all have major transit components. So, we're building just a few big capacity projects right now, and each and every one of them has built within it effectively some form of BRT. It looks a little different depending on where it is, but a very central element that has been kind of universal across our projects. So, we haven't been able to count it yet, but the fact that we sort of know we're going to need to do it, and that we need to show what this looks like, has given everybody a jolt on making these policies real. I think
thank you, Director. I'm going to start wrapping it up, but those are some great takeaways. Do you have anything else?
One more thing that I just wanted to
please do
really fast. I think one of the things that we're also seeing as a very quick impact here is that the role of the MPOs in the state has changed much faster than I would have expected. In particular, the major MPO for the Denver area has started to play a very hands-on role, working with their subsidiary agencies to be kind of candid with them about what will work and not work within the framework of this policy. And one of the goals of this was to empower them to be able to kind of be a convener in a more impactful way. And I think it is having that effect very quickly. So that's just something, given the audience, that I wanted to put up top. Thanks.
That is great. Thank you for adding that. And, as an MPO, we understand that role. So I'm going to skip. So I see that Eric's been promoted. And Rebecca, I'm going to move on, if that's okay, from the Colorado and switch over to the other side of the state, over to California, starting with Eric, and then I'll go to Susan next to kind of introduce yourself and tell us background on policy or what you're working on. Okay, and Eric's got a slide here he wants to share with us. Go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. Just something to look at while I do my quick intro. Eric Sundquist, I'm in the Director's Office in Caltrans, where I focus on implementing legislation here called SB 743, which pushes us to look at induced demand from our projects and our operating our system, which you can look at. This is a little bit of an infographic because induced demand turns out to be a little unintuitive to people. But I assume that this group is pretty familiar with it. So we can come back to sort of the mechanisms of induced demand later. So just in this brief introduction, the motivation for all of this is severalfold. One, it's bad for congestion. So we have had many projects that have been studied, some in peer-reviewed literature and others less formally, that have involved widenings that when you came back a few years later were just as congested as they were to begin with. And so just as a transportation impact, adding capacity is now under greater scrutiny here in California. Secondly, the environmental impacts, not only emissions, but also safety, noise, things like that, and equity, because we've tended to pump this traffic into communities that are lower income or people of color, because wealthier people tend to self-select out of highway corridors. And then thirdly, through just stewardship of the system, ever widening it puts a huge burden on our ability to maintain and operate the system. So three big reasons for the motivation. What are we doing broadly to how the process works? And we're happy to take questions, come back to it. This operates under our CEQA environmental law. So like any other impact, whether it's wetlands or noise or something like that, traffic impact is now measured under CEQA. So we have to assess a project for the impact. If it's significant, we'd like to reduce that significance by maybe rescoping the project or not doing it. But if it goes forward, then we have to try to mitigate it to the extent possible. Shoshana touched on that. We can talk about mitigation. I will say at a high level, mitigation for VMT impacts is very expensive. So to the extent you can avoid mitigation, it's much better. And then we have to decide whether to go forward or not. If we can't fully mitigate it, we have a process for that we can talk about. Finally, a couple other things to just kind of like prime the pump if there are questions later. The way we measure this, which is part of this discussion today, it is not wholly dependent on demand models. And we can talk about why that is. There are some issues with using demand models and some other tools that Susan can speak to that she's had a huge role in that help us surmount some of the limitations of demand models. And we have a lot of other things that we're measuring alongside VMT, one of which is GHG under CEQA. We also do benefit cost ratio for trying to prioritize projects. Those don't yet sync up with our traffic impact analysis in terms of methodology, in that they do not really take into account reduced demand. So hopefully that's a menu that folks could pick up on and ask questions about as we go forward. So glad to be here. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Eric. It was really interesting, and I look forward to diving in deeper. And Susan, since you're based in California, would you like to also kind of give us an overview? I know you also work with Eric on what you're working on.
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Susan Handy. I'm on the faculty at the University of California at Davis, where I direct the National Center for Sustainable Transportation. And for the last 10 years or so, my team and I have been doing work for the California Air Resources Board, as well as Caltrans, to help the state implement its AB 32 policy, which put in place targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and more specifically SB 375, which put in place targets for the metropolitan areas to reduce their vehicle miles of travel. So we've done a variety of different projects that focus on using the empirical evidence that's out there, created by the research community, to better understand what are the potential impacts on vehicle miles traveled and greenhouse gas emissions of various sorts of strategies. including things like investments in transit, land use policies, bike ped facilities, so on and so forth. So we've done some work, as I said, for the California Air Resources Board that I can point you to if you're interested. Another project that got quite a bit of attention was our induced travel calculator that Eric indirectly referred to, and I'm happy to talk about that. And then a more recent project for Caltrans on benefits for sort of ways of understanding and quantifying the full range of benefits for active travel projects. And there are probably others I'm forgetting about at the moment. But I should say, you know, kind of the key themes here are evidence-based. So we're looking at the empirical evidence. We're not doing big scale travel demand forecasting models. We're looking at the empirical evidence and extracting from that elasticities or other ways of understanding the relationships between a strategy you might adopt and then the impact on vehicle miles of travel. And most of our work, I would say, is project level. So it's about evaluating the impacts for a specific project, whether it's a highway project or a development project or a bike lane, rather than analysis for an entire plan.
Great. Thank you very much, Susan, for that succinct overview. I'm going to go to the southern part of the United States next, to Kung Wai, and then I'll finish on the East Coast with Dan. So Kung Wai, please introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. I'm very happy to be this panel member, since particularly I came from Portland, Oregon. I've been a Metro ex-employee for 20 some years. And I got a job in Atlanta. So now I live in Atlanta, and it's about 14 years. Time goes so fast. So my heart is still in Portland. And whenever I visit Portland, I feel home, and I'm very happy. Okay, so myself, as I said, my career started with the Metro as a modeler. And when I got my job in Atlanta ARC, I became a quasi between modeler and a planner. The reason was because I found out later, but planners are dreamer and the modelers are quasi engineer. So they really don't talk to each other and they don't understand each other. So probably not only Atlanta, but anyway, ARC really needed the person in between. Somebody can understand the model and the link to the planning purposes. So here we go. My broken English became a middle of this center connecting to the planner and engineer, maybe better. So I just using lots of facts and performance measure to talk about what's going on with it. And of course, my as a modeler experience is really helpful to explain the planner something is not achievable or it's not possible or it can do it. So I can helping them quite well, I think, as earthy ways, like there's no real science, you know, is because modeling is art. We really have to understand in and out why we're doing it and how we're doing it and how we can communicate and understanding the future, current, even regional level, county level, city level, and the link level, project level. Not only that, this emerging new era is just, we're not gonna understand it. So I have one question, Margie, is that can I use my PowerPoint as speaking here or should I wait until later?
I think at this point, because we're a little behind schedule, if you don't mind waiting, and I will point to you in user discretion and kind of the Q&A. I do want to kind of get us a little bit on schedule though. Thank you for asking. If you don't mind, we'll hold it and go to it.
So basically modeling is absolutely art form with the numbers and the statistics and all the technique behind it. But understanding it, just the average Joe has to understandable. So modeling is not more than, you know, just common sense, how we can get there. And again, there's no one silver bullet So one model is not going to solve all our questions or answering. We really need different scale, different geography, and different time being. And there's many, many ways we had ensemble together, make a great music to orchestrate it. So this is, to me, model is my heart. And any questions, I really like to share what ARC is doing, because that's what I'm doing it at this moment. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Love your modeling heart. Thank you for being here. And go ahead, Dan, please introduce yourself.
Sure. Yeah. Hi, I'm Dan Flynn. I'm a data scientist at the Volpe National Transportation Systems Center in Cambridge, Mass, part of the U.S. Department of Transportation. And the reason I'm here is because I help support a tool. It's called Vision Eval, which is one of the possible tools that can be used to assess the impacts of policies at a fairly broad landscape scale, regional or statewide scale even. And folks at Metro have been using that to look at what are the impacts of potential policies for performance metrics like your greenhouse gas emissions from transportation. And this is I'm happy to be following Kyung-Hwa because she's a power user of the Vision Eval set of models. And also she really nicely explained that there are multiple scales that are needed. And I also have some slides that we can look at to show where the Vision Eval models fit in at that higher strategic level. It's not at the individual project level. It's really at assessing impact of policies region-wide, which is why it can be appropriate for uses like what Metro is trying to do.
That's great. So why don't we weave in, I'll make sure in the questions, I'll call out that both you, Dan, and Kyung-Hwa have some slides, especially probably related to Vision Eval. We'll do that a little bit later to keep us on schedule. And that was a great segue to the Metro presentation because we are looking at that tool Vision Eval and testing it right now. So with no further ado, I want to introduce Principal Planner Kim Ellis. Many of you may know her from her work on Climate Smart, and then following her is Taya Patton, who's our lead climate modeler. So with no further ado, Kim, please.
Great, thanks, Margie, and thank you to the panelists for being here today. We're really excited. I'm very excited to learn from you as we go forward. So I am going to give
You got it? Okay, you muted there for just a second.
Yep,
okay, all right, we're
now I'm going. So I'm going to give a very brief presentation on giving an overview of Climate Smart and how it was developed. I want to start first just sort of acknowledging that Oregon has a long history of working together collaboratively, adopting and implementing policies that really are positioning our state to meet our climate goals. And that started with adoption of the statewide planning goals and Oregon's land use program back in the 70s that led to Metro adopting our 2040 growth concept. And then subsequently in the early 2000s or mid 2000s, the legislature was adopting statewide goals for all greenhouse gas emissions reduction, and then continued as to focus on transportation, as Councilor Gonzalez said. In Oregon, transportation accounts for about 40% of our greenhouse gas emissions, and it's led through adoption of targets, which I'll talk a little bit about, development of our Climate Smart strategy in 2014, and then that was fully incorporated into the Regional Transportation Plan back in 2018. Oregon Department of Transportation also, as part of that legislative history, developed and adopted the statewide transportation strategy for greenhouse gas emissions that our Climate Smart strategy is helping support and implementation of. These are the targets that were first adopted by the Land Conservation and Development Commission. They adopted 2035 targets back in 2011. This is while we were in process with Climate Smart, so we really didn't know what it would take to get to these targets. The targets were adopted for each of Oregon's metropolitan areas. Our region was the first out of the gates to develop a strategy, adopt it and implement it. It was advisory for the other metropolitan areas. Since then, since 2011, the Commission adopted subsequent targets out through the year 2050 that are basically what is needed to be on track to meet the statewide greenhouse gas reduction goals. And then now, as Margie said, there's been more recent rulemaking that is requiring cities and counties in each of these metropolitan areas to develop transportation and land use plans that will help get towards these targets. Our foundation has always been in all of the work that Metro does, the 2040 growth concept. This is a land use concept, a vision for how and where we're going to grow the transportation system that's needed to support that land development pattern, focusing on centers, corridors, also protecting access to our ports and industry in the region, and doing so in a way that is building towards the 6 desired outcomes that you see on the right of the screen there. This was adopted in 1995 and has been a cornerstone for all of our work for transportation planning, as well as development of the climate smart strategy. The strategy that we developed and was adopted by both the Joint Policy Advisory Committee on Transportation and the Metro Council in 2014 comprised of all of these different policy and strategy areas, implementing our land use plans, expanding transit, making biking and walking more safe and convenient, optimizing how our system is operating in terms of the streets and highways, using technology, travel demand management strategies and information, managing parking. One thing I would like to say as well that I didn't highlight in the targets, that our targets were reductions in greenhouse gas emissions that were in addition to what the state assumed would be accomplished through changes in fleet and technology. So those assumptions were given to us, and then our strategy built on that, and then we were to achieve deeper reductions beyond what was anticipated to come from the transition of fleet and technology to be lower carbon, zero carbon, and electrification. Our process, Director Liu's comment about having a big tent, we had a very big tent in developing the climate smart strategy, and many meetings, many workshops, many discussions. It was very broad, inclusive, and it's built, I think, a key outcome of that has really been a way in which it continues to resonate. And at the regional table, it's driving planning and policy decisions at the regional table. It's also being implemented at the local level. And many of these partners are continuing to work with Metro and the state to implement the climate smart strategy, but also hold us accountable to meeting the targets and implementing the plan. So we take that very seriously, and we want to continue as part of this regional transportation plan update, continuing to expand that tent and bring more voices to the table as we review and update the strategy. So back in 2018, when we did our first monitoring report as part of the last update to the regional transportation plan, we found that we were making satisfactory progress. That assumes that we're fully implementing the RTP, but we also recognized at that time that more work and funding is going to be needed. We were doing well and meeting our monitoring targets around growth in our mixed use areas, transit service, as well as households served by transit frequent service. But we did find that we were falling short in completing our active transportation network, increasing walking, biking, and transit mode share in the way that we would need to meet our targets, and then also fell short of reducing our vehicle miles traveled. So that is work that we know a lot has changed since 2018, and so this is the RTP update is a great opportunity for us to sort of look at where we are and how we need to change the strategy and our actions and priorities as we go forward to help stay on track to meeting our targets. So I'm going to hand it over to Taya to give a brief overview of some of the modeling tools that we've been using at Metro.
Hello, I'm Taya Patton. I'm a researcher and modeler here at Metro, and I'm just going to start out with this sort of a solar system of tools that we have at our disposal here. I'd also like to call back a little bit to Kunghua, because I'm not sure everybody in the audience is familiar with all of the modeling tropes. One of the modeling tropes is modeling is both an art and a science. And another one of them is all models are wrong, but many models are useful. So with that in mind, let's start here. You can see I've highlighted the tools I'm going to talk about today. In the center is the 4-step travel demand model. It's bigger than the others for a reason. It is our main model, our big model. And MOVES is an emissions tool. Again, off to the side there's GreenStep and Vision Eval, which are both VMT and greenhouse gas tools that I will talk about as well. Next slide. So Kim talked about the 2040 growth concept before, and I'm just going to say very briefly that the tools we were using then were much earlier versions of the travel demand model, and a program called Mobile 6. And Mobile 6 was an air quality tool. At that point, we were primarily focused on air toxics rather than greenhouse gas. So our focus has shifted considerably since then. Next slide. So where we started with Climate Smart was with the tool called GreenStep. And GreenStep was sort of the beginning of the evolution of the Vision Eval tool. And so as Dan alluded to before, it is a strategic planning tool. It's very high level. It's just, telling us what it would take to get to our goals. It's based on demography, roadway characteristics, and vehicle characteristics. Next slide. So our approach in Climate Smart was to come up with different policy levels. You can see here that we, chose maybe 2 or 3 different levels depending on, which of the policy levers we were examining. And one of the benefits of GreenStep was that it was very lightweight and we could test every possible combination of these different policy levels. Next slide. After we looked at 144 scenarios, which is kind of a lot to process, we narrowed it down to 3 that were sort of a low, medium, and high investment scenario. And then after that came up with our preferred scenario that you can see is somewhere between the adopted plans and the more aspirational plans. Next slide. So moving on past the original Climate Smart effort, we did bring what we learned in Climate Smart into the 2018 RTP. And so then we're in this using the main travel demand model area. So the travel model has a lot of names. They call it the trip-based model, they call it the 4-step model. I would say it's very important to note that it is the federally mandated model that we need to use for transit projects, for the RTP. It is a tool for testing transportation alternatives, and it is based on observed data that is collected through a travel survey that's conducted in our region and in our state. And so just to call that out a little bit, it's not entirely based on assumptions. It's based on actual human behavior of people in our region. Next slide. So in the 2018 RTP, we use the travel demand model in conjunction with MOVES. MOVES is an EPA tool that we are also mandated to use. And it's sort of a next generation of Mobile 6. It allows us to look at air toxics, but it also quantifies GHGs for us. Next slide. So things get a little bit tricky when you start mixing and matching tools. We began with GreenStep, we moved on to the travel demand model and MOVES for the 2018 RTP. We really were not able to look at exactly the same metrics for those 2 things just because they measure things differently. The target is written in a certain way, it's household based, it's per capita, it's based on 2005. And so when you're looking at these outputs and setting these targets, you can see a number like 20% reduction. And 20% reduction can mean a lot of different things depending on the metric you're looking at. And so that's something we have to be very careful about when we're talking about greenhouse gas, because on-road greenhouse gas with trucks versus household greenhouse gas per capita are two extremely different metrics. Next slide. So in the RTP, we found a 46% reduction. You might remember we found 29% reduction in the climate smart work, carrying forward basically the same assumptions. But I would have to point out that this is based on 2015 and not 2005. And so we're in that territory where we are mixing apples and oranges. And we got a bit of criticism for this approach just because we're not entirely being consistent with the state rulemaking by reporting different metrics than what the state rulemaking was based on. Next slide. And then we come to Vision Eval, which is sort of the current evolution of Green Step. It's gone through a lot of different states, and like Dan was saying, we have developed a regional level VERSPM, and then there's also the state level Vision Eval, which is the tool that the state has used to define our targets. And so rather than apples and oranges, it's sort of apples and grapples. They're not exactly the same thing, but but there's far more consistency between VERSPM and VE state than there is between that and the travel model. We developed this in conjunction with ODOT and the city of Portland, and we've developed it for many years. We came up with a 2005 and a 2010 base year for this particular effort, and then the years 2020 to 2050 in 5-year increments. And so that's allowed us to do a lot of different things. It was extremely data intensive to put together the inputs for that, but it does allow us to show the pivot from 2005 to either 35, 40, or 50, which is how our original target was written. So we can compare back to the work that we did with Climate Smart. And also having the, basically current forecasted year to 2050 in 5-year increments lets us see which policies have more impact in the short term versus the long term, and how those policies interact over time. Next slide. So yeah, I kind of already just talked about that. So yes, that's why we're here. That's what we've been doing so far, and we'd like to hear from you to find out if we could learn more and learn how to do things better.
Thank you, Taya. Thank you, Kim. That was a great overview, and we are here to learn and excited now. Metro is going to stop doing the talking, and we want to hear from our distinguished panel. I think what I'm going to do is kind of combine a couple questions, and then I'm going to, Dan, I'm giving you early warning. I'm going to ask you to kick it off, given your work. So first, what is your processes for conducting a VMT or GHG analysis, and what are the tools you're using, and how are they accounting for different factors? So both the question of kind of process and tools. And since we just ended with Taya, and Dan, you have so much experience with Vision Eval, I thought maybe you could be our segue. And feel free at this time if you want to share your slides to give that overview.
Sure. So I will, just 1 second here. Yeah, so the products that I've helped support, and like I said, I'm in a role of helping to develop the tools and popularize the tools, but I'm not within an agency that's actually running.
Dan, can you tell us a little bit, for those who don't know, where you work and what Volpe does, just as a background?
For sure. And by the way, am I sharing my screen now?
You are.
Yeah. Okay.
You are.
Yeah. So I'm at the Volpe Center, so we're part of the federal U.S. Department of Transportation. We're a fee-for-service organization within the DOT, which means that we're basically an in-house consultancy on the federal side. And in the context of this work, I work with folks in the Federal Highway Administration Office of Planning. who for many years have supported and helped develop the Green Step model that was first built within Oregon at ODOT, and then helped to turn that into the more broader modeling framework that we call Vision Eval, that includes a few different types of models, including the statewide VE state, as well as the more regional one. The acronym is RSPM, which is a bit of a mouthful, but they play very well with each other. And the work that I do here is to help support users of the Vision Eval models, like Kyunghwa down in Atlanta, as well as Taya here in Metro. So
I have a fun fact, Dan, that Brian Greger is in the audience. For those who don't
hi,
know,
okay.
I just saw his name. We've got 156 people in the audience, but Brian Greger was the father, or in this case, maybe even grandfather of Green Step. So I just had to do a shout out to Brian while he's here.
Glad he's here. Brian wrote all the original code and has poured a lot of work into this. And he was within ODOT and has branched out on his own. So all this is thanks to his work. So yeah, so Vision Eval, one way that we explain what it does is it's in between these other more detailed types of models, like the activity-based models. It also has components that interact with land use at regional levels, and as well has features of what's referred to as a sketch model, which just is saying, okay, we just want to know what are the parameters of what's the range of uncertainty for our outcomes given our policy choices. So that's one reason to use the Vision Eval type of model. For the purposes of what you want to do in terms of estimating VMT, it's quite good at estimating the vehicle miles traveled, the VMT, at that regional level, and also even at a more granular level, including within census tracts. But it's not trying to estimate the individual behaviors of each person traveling over a single bridge, for instance. So it's not a project level analysis tool. That's where the travel demand modeling type of approach, or the 4-step model that Taya referred to, would fit in. And then this is actually the same triangle diagram that Taya showed here.
That's awesome.
This is slightly more detail in it, but it's something that we really like showing, because it says, where Vision Eval and more generally these type of strategic models fit in. It is about that long range visioning. That's where the vision part comes in the name, thinking about what are the range of outcomes going to be given policy choices or assumptions about maybe exogenous changes, like where the population growth might be at a regional level, or where densification might occur. Those are separate from policy choices per se, but this framework lets you explore those type of changes that might occur. And then the 4-step model, that fits in more in this operational level. So that's not what Vision Eval does.
Thanks. So I'm hearing both you and Taya really distinguish between the travel demand model and other models, and the tactical, and really the Vision Eval and the strategic. So I appreciate that overview. I'm thinking, Dan, are you wrapping up here? Do you have any more slides?
I don't. I have more that I could talk about.
Well, let's stop here, because I want to do a little compare and contrast, perhaps, with this panel, and maybe go over to California, which I know is focused more on VMT. Eric, could you speak to the questions I asked in terms of your process and how do you measure greenhouse gases and or VMT?
Sure. So as I alluded to at the beginning, we do VMT and GHG differently, which we're trying to reconcile. It's not, the GHG measurement comes out of the conformity setting with the, as has been mentioned, with moves and all of that. With VMT, which is what we're concerned about because it drives VMT, as Susan said, we have moved toward other tools and the NCST calculator that she mentioned. So let me just talk about the VMT and then where it departs from GHG. So for VMT, we are concerned because of the statutory situation in CEQA at the project level. So even if the demand models were great at doing induced demand, that makes it pretty clunky because it's a very laborious to do project by project on the regional demand models. And some of them impossible because the projects are just too small. They may all be within one task or something like that. California does not have any iterative transportation land use models. So even if we had a good activity-based model that was parcel-based, and the granularity was less of an issue, we would still have an issue in VMT in terms of the induced land use effect. So right now, if you try to use a demand model at the project level, say you have a project that's big enough that it does move the needle in the model, that's not a problem. You would still have to go in and create a new no-build land use scenario. And so that is a pretty high hill to climb to try to be able to do that. When MPOs do their modeling round for their long-range plans, they do a economic and sort of ground truth-based land use scenario. It's very laborious to do, and so doing that project by project is very problematic. So because induced land use is not built into the modeling, and we could go into some other issues with models as well. It's not like we're abandoning them. SB 375 that Susan mentioned is all about models. That's how it's judged if you're meeting your regional target. So it's not like these are gone. But so we have opted for a more targeted project level assessment that uses the models to the less extent possible. And so the NCST calculator is a big step up in that. It is based on elasticities out of the literature. If we get this many lane miles, we would expect to get this much more VMT. It's super straightforward and easy to do. It doesn't cover everything. So if we have a new interchange, we're back to the modeling because it's not lane miles. So the assessment of VMT is moving forward. One of the things that the NCST calculator allows project teams to do is interpolate their results with a demand model so they can get to this land use effect and try to use both. We've had a couple who've done that. But being based on lane miles, the NCST calculator doesn't help us on the other side of the coin, which is if we do some transit or TDM or something, what is the VMT reduction that we might see in terms of mitigation? So that's a project that we're actively working on, again, with Susan. So that's kind of it in a nutshell, how we're looking at VMT. Lots more to unpack, obviously. GHG, again, goes through the conformity type process, through moves, which is really focused on, what is the fleet mix, and what are it's very precise about fleet mix and emissions per mile from different types of vehicles and different speed bins during different times of the day. Where in VMT we don't really care about all of them. We just want to know the total VMT. Where we run into conflicts, I'll give you an example. A road diet can look bad in GHG world, in conformity world, because the cars are going slower and maybe even idling a little bit more. It looks great in VMT world because cars are going slower and maybe even idling a little bit. And so that's an issue for us. And I mentioned that the VC model, benefit cost model, also has an issue with not having that feedback loop in terms of induced demand. So hopefully that gives you a kind of a sense.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. And I appreciate the compare and contrast. I find it interesting that you found a way in California to do both, right? Both a VMT calculator and use a travel demand model. I'm curious from Colorado, specifically Rebecca and or Eric, how would you contrast what Eric is doing in California to how Colorado approaches it? I know some of you're doing some project level work there as well.
I think Rebecca's expecting I'll take that one. Thanks, everybody. I'm Eric Sabina. I didn't, do personal intro, but among other things, I have the travel demand forecasting group under me. Very briefly, I was at the Denver Regional Council of Governments and led the development of their activity-based model project, and then was recruited over to CDOT about 10 years ago to do the same thing at CDOT. So a couple of years ago, we got to the point where we had what is one of the only sort of full blast activity-based, fully disaggregate models at a DOT, state level in the US that I'm aware of. And not that long after getting that model stood up, started deep water on the subject of greenhouse gas. I would echo an awful lot of the things that Eric said. It is certainly true that these activity-based models, and even a 4-step model, but the activity-based models are somewhat more so, are a big machine, and they take a lot of crank turning to get an answer out. And as Eric noted, the really small projects, in some cases, you just can't see them in a model of that sort. So somewhat coincidentally, I guess, and I would say on the order of 7 or 8 years ago, Federal Highway approached us and asked us if we would be interested in working with a consultant to develop an instance of EarPat, which is, on the spectrum there, as it were, of Green Step to Descendants models. And so we did that and, went through that process. So we have right now, I'd say we have sort of 2 things that I'd call models that we are making use of in this context. One is the statewide, big honkin' activity-based super disaggregate model, and the other one is EarPat. We also make use of just sort of study-based work as well. And we're working with a consultant to help us to do, I'm forgetting who was talking about it earlier, but to mine various studies. I think it was probably Professor Handy, it was worth to put this on my mind, to mine a number of studies around the country for elasticities and reasonable relationships between, an input and an output, essentially. So we're kind of using all 3 of those things, the big model, EarPat, and then this sort of empirically based work. And it's a little bit of a matter of practicality of what's practical to do at the moment and in the pace that we're happen to be operating at the time. I
Can
did
ask
want
Eric a question, a follow-up question, and this may be for both you and or Rebecca. How do you use the various tools for decision making? Like, how does that tie in? I know Colorado as a state has done some really great work on their state GHG goals, as your director articulated, but how does each model kind of help decisions be made?
Maybe I could make a remark and then I'll toss it over to Rebecca, who's more in the decision space than I am. But when we were creating the GHG rule that Rebecca can talk much more knowledgeably about than I can, we developed a set of scenarios, sort of a short version of the answer to your question. As we were trying to decide, for example, how much greenhouse gas reduction seemed reasonable and practical, we tended to use the terms aggressive but feasible. And to answer that, we developed a set of 3 scenarios, and using a combination of EarPat and the statewide model, and came up with, sort of, for lack of a better term, low, medium, high estimates, with sort of groups of measures that were attached to each of those 3, so that people could see, what exactly did we do that went along with this particular outcome among these different 3. So that's one comment, and then I'll stop and let Rebecca talk.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. And it's a good question because, you know, what you're seeing is we use these various model tools to figure out how to develop the greenhouse gas standard that we wrote. Now we're implementing the standard and having to use these model tools to figure out if we're meeting it or not. And so we'll use the travel demand model to look at the combined impact of our long range plan, which is only a 10-year plan for CDOT. But to the extent that we cannot achieve our own standard with our mix of projects, then the next thing we'll be doing is turning to these mitigation tools, which are honestly a combination of using EarPat to look at the effectiveness of turning various dials. And then we've essentially developed a spreadsheet of the greenhouse gas reductions we would expect from 1 mile of bike lane and X increase in transit. And that is based, as Eric said, on a lot of literature review so that we come up with some factors that we think we can justify. So sort of getting back to the beginning of this combination, it is kind of or beginning of this conversation, it's a bit of an art and a science of using the tools and the models where to the extent we can. And then when we sort of can't stretch that any further, we turn to other tools we have to create this entire picture of what's going on in a very complicated system. And I wish there was just like one magic tool. But I agree with Eric Sundquist that right now we're dealing with the limitation of moves and complete streets, because when you run a complete street through moves, it shows a worse outcome. And we know that a complete streets is achieving a lot of what we want for the state and greenhouse gases. So how do we, should we move away from moves and look at more of a spreadsheet model to determine that? And yeah, we're right in the middle of it now. So this is very timely. It's talk therapy for Colorado.
It's such a good point, especially given the federal infrastructure bill and the focus on complete streets coming out of that federal funding. So important conversation. Thanks, Rebecca. I think that's a good pivot to Kang-Wai, if you don't mind joining us again as our modeler planner. I see you've got your volume off, but I don't see your screen on. Maybe this is a good time for us, Bridge, to talk about your processes, the tools you're using, and how you help make decisions in the Atlanta region. And feel free to share screen if you'd like to, Kang-Wai.
Okay, I think that's good time to share my screen and where my PowerPoint's gone. Okay, can you see my PowerPoints?
No, I can't. We've got.
Okay.
Oh, there, I think it's coming on. So just patient. Now it's just small. If you can expand it.
Okay.
We'll try not to look at your schedule for the day.
Okay. All right.
Okay, there we go. Okay. We're good.
Maybe time for just to give you maybe one-on-one what I think of a modeling is. So that will everybody, maybe I preaching choir here, but just to recap about what this black box means and what ARC is doing and I'm working on. So that'll helpful for everybody's, I think, positioning where we are. So this is I don't need explaining. Every agency is based on the performance measures. We, put all together visions and the performance measure process and the project evaluation and allocate the resources. And we want to understand whether it worked or not. That's the whole point, right? And that's what we're doing. Let's talk about the traditional travel demand model. It's just in simple ways, it's actually understanding demand and the supply. And that's what model is. And that demand is how many people, where they live, where they work, and how many, network capacity we have. That's what we understand through the network and assignment process. And then there's 4 key traveler decision point, regardless activity-based model or trip-based model, any kind of a model, there's 4 decision, whether you're gonna travel or not, and where you're gonna go, what mode you're taking, and what route you're using. That's what we put in the so-called black box model demand side and supply side, and all combined, that result, we're gonna get VMT, we're talking about vehicle mile travel, congestion level, network, and regional and link level. That's what our trip models basically, either activity. But let's sit back. What is true about travel? Actually, there's so many other variables. Economics, behavior, you name it. And we only talking about through the model's point of view is accessibility and mobility. This is the main actor we having. So bottom line, our travel model can cover what true reality? Of course not. That's why, is this wrong? I don't think so. It is, but it's not perfect. Even not cut the huge percent, but we go through this reality with the model's eye and have a very consistent performance. I think that is important. So truth about the understanding this word, I don't think we can understand. If I can understand, I maybe now invest the stock market. That what I make a rich. But of course, nobody can do that. And I think a travel, modeling, same thing. Is maybe worse. So what we try to understand the many decades is this is the how we understand so-called scenario. Just understand existing and the shifting land use and the give transportation option and the model result. That was 1995, what we did, model, Vision 2040 in Portland, I worked on that. And same time, many RTP model. This is it, because the main model is the demand, understanding demand, and put the new infrastructure, and that's how we make assignment. But this is really challenging. I think after the cell phone, and we observed by big brothers, whoever, and we have this huge understanding in how people travel, particularly understanding congestion in the actual actors, we realize, oh my God, our model cannot compete. Of course not, because model is a steady and understanding future and put the place into this so-called, black box and the trajectory of the future. But word is so complex and no longer this static model gonna explain the future, not at all, period. So let's go back to what our history of modeling. We've done 1970 from simple model to so-called activity-based model. Theory started in 1980. I remember vividly went to New Orleans, and that conference started that activity theories, the nesting model, and blah, 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 all this. And we start actually, Metro, we started a tour-based model and Transym work. I've been worked on about 7 years and when I was in Metro. So Metro started a very early frontier work. In the late 20s, serious scenario modeling started at Greenstep. Dr. Brian, I always call him my professor, he's great. So this kind of a simpler but regional or statewide model, why we started? Because the network modeling takes forever to root back, feed back that utilities and understanding and make it everything is work is too complicated. Bottom line is we really have to separate and connect it again, those scales back. So to me, how are you gonna see the forest and understanding trees? It's huge challenges, basically, because we want to see the tree because that's the what project evaluation. You have to understand that each project, either capacity or even program or land use, whatever we call it, you really have to understand their performance, pro and cons. But same time, you understand total utility, that how much green gas we saved, or how much performance of the congestion released, or how many people not using car, blah, 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 right? That's, we really have to understand small scale and big scale. Can we do that? I don't think so, actually. If you think seriously, we are kidding ourselves. We need separate models, how we get there. So this is the ARC, how we separate each layers, understanding future with a simpler and more robust, the variables and the not network involved. So that's what Vision Eval. If people think Vision Eval can do understand your next neighbor's street, no, it's not. It's not there. But least other very flexible variables and the elements we can understand the future, and we can see the sum totality, what's going on in this region or this state with this various assumption, policy, program, and other information. And then you bring that information, you really have to understand your network actually modeling, either trip-based model or activity-based model. The reason I'm using trip-based model, because ABM activity-based model is so complicated and take too long to run. And the network analysis, you need a fast runtime, model runtime. So, and understanding network result, it's okay to using a trip-based model and perfectly fine to me. So that's our official model is activity-based model, but we're using trip-based model a lot for the purpose of the analyzing it.
Analyzing it. So thanks. If you could wrap it up. Oh, this is fun. Okay.
So I have just a couple more. This is my
Okay.
situation. I think I need the 3 glasses. At my age, I need a reading glass, computer glass, driving. Same to me. We need a different layer of tools, different purposes, and to make sure that apple to apple, orange to orange, and not mix it in a way. But you understand continuum, what's going on. So tip is very important. If you have anybody question about project evaluation, we've done it. I can share with you all. So that's where I want to see the connecting. Thank you.
That is great. So if you go back to your previous slide, I do like, well, just to summarize, you've got the visioning for the future, the scenario planning, you're comparing that, that's separate and distinguished from travel demand modeling, which is done at the regional level, and then that's separate and distinct from a project level analysis. I think that's a great summary, and not one tool does it all. There's a question that I kind of want to jump to, and I'm very curious because nobody's mentioned it yet. Kang-Wai, you mentioned land use and transportation, but nobody's really yet talked about how fleet assumptions fit into their analysis, whether you're doing that at the regional, state, or even project level. In my mind, there's quite a lot of debate. There's reason to be optimistic that our fleet would change, but there's also reason to maybe not be as optimistic as maybe we were or Metro was back in 2014. So we haven't heard from Professor Handy on this or lately. I didn't know if Professor Handy wanted to weigh in on where fuels fit, or maybe they don't fit for your induced demand analysis. And feel free to speak your mind on this topic. I think it's a robust topic. Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think there are multiple things going on here. The California Air Resources Board, in their analysis of the state's efforts to meet its targets for reducing greenhouse gas emissions, has concluded that even a very aggressive effort to convert to electric vehicles, which California is now pursuing, is not enough to get us to our targets, that we're going to have to also reduce vehicle miles of travel. And they're about to come out with a new scoping plan that continues to articulate that and to show that with their analysis. So regardless of what happens to the fleet, we have to reduce how much people are driving. And there are, of course, all kinds of reasons to be doing that, beyond greenhouse gas emissions reductions anyway. But we have to remember that greenhouse gas emissions associated with driving are not just from the tailpipe of the car, right? It's also about the car itself and the tires and the road. And there's just this whole life cycle of emissions attributed to driving. So yeah, we can't place all of our hopes on conversion to an electric fleet. And my colleagues here at UC Davis can tell you a little more about that. And the progress towards that conversion and all of that, but it's not enough. We've still got to reduce vehicle miles of travel.
And when you study in your work induced demand, do you kind of hold your fleet assumptions solid, or do you put them aside and really just focus on the VMT aspect of
Well, let me,
transportation?
yeah, a couple of points about that. First, I use the term induced travel, which I think is
Okay.
more accurate. Demand is, anyway, induced travel, because even short of inducing changes to land use or promoting growth in a region, there are going to be shifts in travel that occur when you change the capacity of the highway system. So we like to use the term induced travel to be clear about that. Yeah, and then, we created the calculator, right? So it's used to estimate what's the change in VMT for a given change in highway capacity. And that doesn't get into fleet mix. It's simply about vehicle miles of travel. So that's analysis done by other people.
Gotcha.
But of course, there's a very strong relationship between VMT and GHG. So.
Right. And as Eric said, you have both tools in California. Colorado, Eric, you turned on your camera when this topic came up, which makes me think you've got an interest in this topic. I'm really curious what Colorado is doing with your inputs on fleet. Your thoughts on that, or Rebecca,
Sure.
either one.
Yeah, trying to keep it brief. Colorado Energy Office developed a target for, speaking just of light duty vehicles, for the year 2030. That's just sort of a policy target of, I'm not sure how they got this precise number, because it was before my time on this sort of effort, but their target was 940,000 light duty EVs on the road in Colorado by the year 2030. And that, that contrasts to roughly 5 million total vehicles on the road. So we have used that number as sort of background to the evaluations that we do. So when we are looking at measures to reduce greenhouse gas, one of the things that's been a little challenging for us to sort of get through with our stakeholders is that measures out in the future have less effect on greenhouse gas than they do now, because a measure that's applied to the fleet today has a whole bunch of dirty vehicles to move off the road and reduce VMT and so on. Whereas that same measure, when we look at a scenario out in 2050, we're assuming, by 2050, our rules assuming essentially 100% light duty vehicle penetration by that point. So that means that, VMT related effects have less greenhouse gas reduction. So very briefly, we essentially said, okay, the targets we've been given from a planning and policy perspective are this 940,000 in 2030 and essentially 100% in 2050. So we developed a set of curves that roughly pass through those 2 points. And then we use that as background for all the other analysis that we do.
So you hold that constant, and your colleagues at the Department of Energy really make the decision on that, right? Sounds like, well, to some extent. I'm wondering, Dan or Daniel, if you want to speak to this. I know you've worked with MPOs around the region. Do you have, when you've seen them do modeling work, do you see different approaches to fleet assumptions in terms of GHG emissions?
Sure. So for instance, with Metro, been some experimentation looking at, okay, what can we isolate the assumptions about growth of the electric vehicle share in for light duty, in households versus any other electric vehicles on the road. So that's something that we can do within the VisionML framework that I'm most familiar with, where we actually look at what happens if you hold the fleet assumptions constant, from some certain year where the data are fairly good. Say, okay, what happens if there's no more growth in the EVs? What would the consequences be for the changes in greenhouse gas emissions? So that's one thing that's done. In other places I've seen, for instance, in New York State has also used the Vision models for looking at the impacts of EV market share growth on their greenhouse gas emissions. So I don't know the details of how they developed their fleet assumptions, but there's certainly a role for that in the Vision models.
So Vision allows you to kind of make different fleets assumptions, and then it's really a policy question for what assumptions, for that region, right?
Including any number of combinations of the growth of, for instance, in the medium or heavy duty fleets versus the light duty as well.
I think I was just hoping to get an answer. You would just tell us what to assume, but I'm going to go to Eric. Curious what you think about this in terms of fleet assumptions and how that plays into decision making around GHG and transportation.
Yeah, so like Susan, I'm in VMT world and less in fleet mix world, but I guess I would just say from a and to tack on to Susan's comments, the only reason to get really concerned about that is that if you think we might somehow overshoot our climate goals, I don't think it's that critical to have the precise answer, which we won't, right? We don't know. We have various uptake scenarios of EVs, usually have not been, usually we've been behind rather than ahead of whatever scenario that is. So I would just say estimate it as conservatively and go from there, because yeah, we're on SB 375, we're not meeting our goals. Portland, you guys showed you're not meeting your goal. So why worry about the false precision of like, is it going to be 8% EVs by X year or 12%? Go with the low number, and that's what I would say.
Does any of our other panelists want to weigh in on that? Kung-Wai, do you want to weigh in on this topic?
Well, the fleet, we're talking about these issues, really is a huge issues, and I personally don't have much, the comments on these things. It's really big, and I've been worked on, and when I was Metro, with the freight model, and we hear ARC is working on those things, and it's a very complex itself, even way bigger than even modeling of the travel demand model itself, because it's totally relate to demand of the economics and how logistic going on and the consumption and you name it. So I'm not sure we really can handle well, be honest with that. Just that maybe have a better serious assumption and work with it. And again, this is to me, crucial part is what is our uncertainty? If we understand that, I think we can do better modeling or planning.
Right. So try to narrow the uncertainties through your assumptions, similar like kind of Colorado's approach. So we're 3 minutes before our break. I wanted to get to a question. I'm not sure we're full before we go full panel. So maybe I'll just ask someone who wants to speak to this. Is anybody monitoring the progress in how do you monitor progress? This is something that Metro runs into, particularly when we do a travel demand. I see Rebecca nodding her head. Rebecca, do you want to speak to this?
Yeah, that's also a topic we talk a lot about with our stakeholders, and we often get the question about, well, can't you just go put some air quality monitors out and see how much CO2 is in the air? Like, well,
sounds very
more
familiar.
complicated than that.
Yes.
So what we've committed to do is annual reports, and then every 3 years do a sort of comprehensive look. But that it is hard because there is unlike putting a filter on a smokestack, it's really hard to detect how much change we're actually seeing when you're looking at issues like land use. We can count cars, that's not a problem. We have a good idea of our fleet, but the bigger levers that we're trying to pull, that it's very complicated to explain what our progress will be. And so we've we've committed to produce these series of reports, so we don't have to write them yet. But that's sort of how we've said, we'll get back to you on how this is going, but we need a few years under our belt to know.
And Rebecca, can I ask you, is that progress based on kind of progress on specific strategies to reduce GHG, or is that kind of actual numbers compared to your planning goals?
It would, I think what we'll have to do is actual numbers. So we
Yeah.
will try to generate a CO2 equivalent number for the light duty fleet, which is, doable, and compare that to what we were hoping to achieve with the rule. As we've
There's-
committed, our rule for 2030 would reduce 1.5 million metric tons. That's our objective.
Gotcha. So it's a work in progress for you.
Mhm.
I'm going to call on Eric because California has been working on greenhouse gases. How do you monitor? You've got a minute or two before a break here.
Well, at the gross level, here we've got that. Let's see. Oh, sorry, I meant to share that. You can't see it. This is VMT, not GHG, so we know we're going in the wrong direction. We have various legislatively required analyses that CARB does. And I'd be happy to share. One is in draft coming out, the SB 150 report, AB 285, which was more kind of about why are we still getting bad results, and even though we have all this set up. So there's a lot to monitor, right? It's not just like as Rebecca said, the GHG in one place, one time, which is pretty meaningless. There's the VMT, there's the what are we building and why, where's the money going? What are the financial, policy, legal, institutional, educational, what constraints are there that are pushing us in the wrong direction? All of those should be monitored and checked. So I don't know what it depends on what you mean by monitoring.
Yeah, no, that's great. That was kind of what I was getting at when I asked Rebecca the question, are you monitoring strategies? Because in my mind, the funding strategies, the policy changes, those are strategies to monitor, but it seems like you're doing both. You're monitoring like are your strategies successful, but you've also captured, at the state level, you're monitoring obviously quantitatively the VMT.
Yeah, there's outcome and output issues and like many of both, right? So those two reports that I mentioned are pretty fresh, and that it would be useful for people to take a look at, and you can see where we've done right and where we've had trouble and not make the same mistake.
And Eric, where can folks find those reports if they want to go to like a website?
I will, if I'm able to drop them in the chat, I'll do that.
Or send them to Molly and maybe she could send those out.
I'll do that.
Okay, so we're going to go to our break now. It's 9:02. When we come back, we are going to promote Metro Council members and members of JPAC who are in attendance to go to our Q&A portion. So everybody's going to mute and turn your screen off and get a cup of coffee, do what you need. Thanks. Okay, it's 9:09. I'm gonna ask panelists to turn on your cameras as well as those who are promoted. Good morning, counselors, members of JPAC. Good morning, Counselor Lewis. Good morning, Counselor Gonzalez. Good morning, our Counselor Craddock. She's also our JPAC chair of our MPO board. Great to see you. I see we've got Mayor Callaway here. So we're just turning it on. And it's 9:09. So we will launch into it in a minute. And I also, for the Q&A, it might also be helpful for our panelists to turn on the camera just so we can get a group discussion going if possible. So great. Thank you, Susan. And Molly, it's 9:09, but I will wait to hear from you whether we go. Oh, I see Counselor Heisey coming up. So we can start as people are being promoted as well.
Yeah, I think we can get started. We might see a couple more council or JPAC members pop on, but we're just about there, I think.
Okay, great. So thanks everyone for hanging in there. We still have approximately 150 people in the audience. There's a lot of interest in this panel. Thank you so much for sharing this morning. I am going to open it up to questions. Please use the raise your hand function to ask your questions of the panel, and panelists, feel free to weigh in and I will help moderate if needed. Who would like to go first? I know Mayor Callaway, you are never quiet about modeling. Oh, Counselor Heisey took it first. There you go. Good morning, Counselor Heisey.
Good morning, and I will defer to Mayor Callaway if he had something on the tip of his tongue. All right.
Okay, great.
Well, thank you so much to the presenters this morning. This is really helpful to me. I come in, I'm relatively new to the policy world. You've all worked with electeds enough at this point in your careers that I'm sure you know that most of us come in as volunteers. So it is profoundly useful to have a better understanding of modeling as we are going into RTP work. Like Counselor Gonzalez said at the beginning, I care passionately about climate. I want us to do this work right. I want us to do it well. And I want us to do it in a way that includes the region so that it's not being imposed upon, but is invited, everyone is invited in. So I really appreciate that the context that you've all provided in addition to talking about modeling. One of the things that comes up in our conversations over and over is the tension around induced demand. And I have a million questions here, but Marky said, does anyone want to go? So I sprang up. When I hear people express skepticism around induced demand, I would love to have a better response than the one I currently have around that. What does, in your experience, modeling show that induced demand really results in terms of addressing climate issues and in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions? And how do we most effectively as a region think about it? We've got mega projects with a multiple S on the end in the region coming up. And I want to be an advocate for the solutions that are true solutions to all of the problems we have, not just the solutions we usually reach for. And understanding induced demand better is, I think, key to that. So that was kind of a big question, but that's what you get with me in the morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor Heisey. Perhaps Professor Handy can kick us off, given her world-renowned research on this topic, and then everybody else can weigh in.
Sure. Yeah, there's some great resources out there that explain how induced travel works. Eric showed his infographic. I've got a mini lecture on induced travel that you can find through the National Center for Sustainable Transportation website, NCST. There was a great video done by some guys in LA, and I can never remember what it's called, but it's on YouTube somewhere. There's some from, I've seen some from Australia. Lots of folks have put together very accessible ways to explain induced travel. But, you know, the way I think about it, it's, you know, it's really a pretty simple thing, and it goes back to basic economic principles. If you expand highway capacity, you are in effect reducing the price of driving by making it a little bit faster. You reduce the price of a product, in most cases, people are going to consume more of it. So that's what happens. And in the case of highway expansion, it's people make different decisions about whether or not they're going to make a trip. They make different decisions about what destinations they're going to go to. You know, on a Friday night in Davis, you don't drive to Sacramento for dinner. But if suddenly the congestion on I-80 went away, I might think about going to Sacramento for dinner. So you make different decisions about destinations, different decisions about mode. Over the longer term, there are different decisions about where you live relative to where you work. And then, of course, over even the longer term, there are different decisions made about what kind of land development happens where. And so all of that is gonna change the amount of vehicle miles of travel. And yeah, that's we need to be measuring that. We know that our travel demand models do not do a very good job of that, because a lot of those effects that I just talked about are not reflected in the travel demand forecasting models. Hence the need for a tool like our induced travel calculator that gives us another way of estimating what this effect is going to be. And, you know, for me, speaking frankly, I think Margie said I can speak frankly. You know, what this means is that if our goal is to reduce vehicle miles of travel, we should not in any way be expanding the capacity of the highway system or the roadway system. And of course, there may be other reasons we want to do that, but it works against the goal of reducing vehicle miles of travel. There's just no way around that. That's what all the evidence shows us. And I think all of us know from our experience, you know, as professionals in transportation, that's, you know, we've proven that with decades of highway building and increased vehicle travel. I think one of the big problems around this issue is when we sell the public a line that expanding this highway is going to reduce congestion, right? It may do that a little bit in the short run, but what this induced travel effect is all about is, you know, what that means is that the highway capacity is going to fill up again, you know, within some period of time, some number of years, you're going to be back to where you were. So it's at best a temporary solution to congestion. So we're overselling, you know, regardless of the question of greenhouse gas emissions, we're overselling highway capacity expansion as a solution to this congestion problem.
Can I just add to that, all of which is
Please,
right
yeah.
on. There's also a vicious cycle effect in that as you get this auto-centric development that results from more auto facilities, it undercuts everything you're trying to do on transit and other modes, walking and biking. You cannot, there's not enough money to send transit out to try to serve low density development that you get along highways or that is spurred by highways. And even if you could, it would be very, you know, the service would probably be very bad and not very many people would take it. So you get this mode shift effect away from walking, biking, and transit and to more auto, whether people want to or not. I mean, if the jobs are located in a suburban campus off the highway, and that's where their job is, then you know, if I'd rather not own a car and I'd rather take a transit to work, well, too bad. So anyway, just another exclamation point on what Susan said.
Thanks. This is an interesting topic, and I want other panelists to maybe be a little bit more frank on this. Kangwa, would you like to weigh in? And really, we should have feel free to be open debate on this topic.
Yes, I think two huge uncertainties we don't understand of the future location of the housing and the land use itself due to autonomous vehicles and the teleworking. I think we've seen through the pandemic, there's some changes happening from Atlanta cases. A lot of people move to the suburb and they go to the, further out actually, but still congested. You all know Atlanta is pretty congested. But anyway, all these two things, as we say, there's no good model or prediction. So we have to mindful about how we're gonna go understanding and go about it. And data is not yet to suggest either way, because autonomous vehicle is not there yet, but it will come sooner than later. And I think we all try to, that's why I think scenario testing is huge, give us providing at least a glimpse of what might happen, may not happen, but we have a preparing with the various scenarios.
And maybe I'll put, thank you, Kangwa, maybe, I will put Colorado DOT quickly on the spot here. I'm curious, because I have not heard you mention it, Eric or Rebecca, whether you are taking into account induced demand at all in your analysis, and knowing it's not an easy thing to do, but you have a different perspective on this?
I'll throw in a couple of comments. Thanks, Margie. The virtue of these sort of large activity-based models that goes along with the downside that Kangwa has accurately said, which is that they're big honking machines that take a long time to run and a lot of work from busy modelers to get them going. But the virtue of them is that if they're well built, and I think ours is, then we cover, I usually list 6 elements of induced demand, and in the interest of time, I won't list them unless somebody wants to hear them. But the travel model, the activity-based model will cover 5 of those. And the nice thing about these activity-based models is that a lot of these effects are interlocking effects. To kind of get to what Eric was saying, if you make driving so dominant, then it does, because it's such a heavyweight mode, it does tend to push other modes to the sidelines. And a good deep model helps you to look at those interrelationships. But everybody that's spoken so far is absolutely right that the really difficult thing in the model space remains the land use effect, remains trying to say, if you build a certain corridor or whatever, how much more development might you get in that corridor over the course of years? And that depends on so many factors relating to, for example, is your area a fast growing area or not? Because if it's not a fast growing area, you might not get very much. It's really a thorny problem. And so I would echo again what Kangwa said, that the way we've approached just that one element out of the 6, land use being one of the 6, is we do scenarios and we get a what might happen thing. And that's what supports the policy folks, many of whom are on the meeting today, is that we can give them some, might be this, might be that. Here's the range of possibilities, helping them to think through what to do from a policy perspective.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And we have Councillor Lewis. She's actually our deputy president with her hand up, and we'll have her ask the next question. Councillor Lewis.
Sure. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. I think it's a really great conversation to hear some outside perspectives. I am hoping somebody can shed a little bit of light on the effectiveness of modeling GHG at a project level, particularly as you're looking to put bounds or scope what you're modeling. A lot of what I'm looking at in my part of the region involves diversionary impact. And how do you model for those not shifts of modality, but shifts of corridor in order to really see if you're making an impact or if you're just essentially diverting GHG and some of the emissions say from a highway to a neighborhood or to an arterial or from an arterial to a neighborhood street. I can follow up if that doesn't make sense.
If somebody else can answer, please go ahead, but ARC has a very detailed several ways of understanding actually this air quality and greenhouse gas issues. So basically that's I can explaining, particularly not necessarily greenhouse gas, but the particular matter or other pollutant. We have a link level, the air quality analysis tool we developed consistent with the travel demand model. So you can understand the link level, how the diversion is going on with the different network types. And at the same time, we do have a project levels the air quality analysis tool, which is a simple spreadsheet model, but that's how we, depending on this small scale of air quality impact, we calculate that too. So again, this is not one shot modeling. It's you, depending on your purpose, how you understand that, you have to either, sometimes you have to model, comprehensively model and get a result on the network fatalities, but some of them is you can deal with at the project level or small scales too. So there's many multiple way you can understand. That's how we ARC approached it.
Thank you, Kang Wei. Would others, I think, Eric, you've got your mic off in terms of project scope and how you model that.
Yeah,
Sorry.
I'm going to
Go ahead,
call on
Eric.
Eric Sundquist and then we'll go to Eric Sabina. Sorry, I just realized we had two Erics, so
We're
that's
taking
great.
over too many Erics. No problem. So one thing is, when you're talking about GHG, it doesn't really matter where it's emitted, right? We're looking at the total. With criteria pollutants, it matters where it's emitted and safety and other impacts. So you could have a situation where a highway widening is shown to divert traffic away from a neighborhood and reduce safety or other localized impacts, but raise GHG. I mean, that is just something you have to deal with. And under CEQA, what we are charged with doing by the statute is weighing all those impacts and trying to mitigate them to the extent feasible. That's the statutory language, and then make a decision whether we go forward. So it can become a policy decision about one or the other. But as far as how I've brought up a lot of cautions about the limitations of modeling, and others have too, but really models are about distributing traffic on the network. That's really what they're about. I mean, they came about in the 50s and 60s as we were suburbanizing and we needed to know what to widen first, basically. That was really the whole thing. And where would the traffic flow if we widened this or if we didn't widen that? And so to the extent that your model is granular enough to show neighborhood level effects, which they aren't always, it's often is a TAS connector and all you see is the arterials. That's what we would look at. But we would, at the end of the day, we would weigh the two. If there's a countervailing effect, we would have to sit down and try to figure out which one we could live with or neither and come up with a different plan.
So you would look at different scenarios kind of at that project level.
Yeah, I mean, at the project level, you usually call it project alternatives, not scenarios so much. But yeah, it would be part of scoping the project, or in the regulatory sense, deciding whether the project can go forward or how to mitigate it.
Can I ask, is it possible to get that level of granularity in a model, like early in a project, or only once a project's like gone through NEPA and you're already like established?
So great question. It is possible to do it sooner. Because NEPA is sort of this giant tail wagging the dog that has supposed to be about planning, but it kicks in after the alternatives have been selected usually, which is backward because where was the planning up front? And there are reasons for that. People don't want to invest a lot of time in running a lot of alternatives to the ground until there's a chicken and egg thing, right? About like, we need to get the alternatives so then we can evaluate them, but it would be better to evaluate them up front to form the alternatives. So that's a policy decision. you could put more egg, you could switch that order, and we're trying to do that. We are trying to redo our purpose and need statements for projects to encompass the environmental outcomes. Because under the NEPA CEQA mindset, it's like, well, we decide on the mobility outcome and the alternatives, and then we kick in these analyses later. And we try to shave the rough edges off. And then if we can't, we just go for it. Frank, I mean, that's kind of what it's been. So put all that stuff up front. And yes, it depending on the tools that you have, and you guys should have really good ones, you should be able to front load some of that.
Thanks, Eric Sundquist. And just for those in the audience who may not know, in California, CEQA is essentially the equivalent to NEPA. It's the state version of it. So we're talking just in a NEPA context, which is most Oregonians are familiar with. Eric Sabino, would you like to weigh in on this kind of project level analysis and lessons learned?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that Councilor Lewis got a sort of a clear technical response, at least for me anyway, which is the tools are available. You know, the takeaway is the tools are definitely available to help do project level analysis. And, you know, maybe to sum up a little bit of what's been said, it does take a sort of a multi-set of tools. One of the ones you need is these sort of larger models we've been discussing so that you can evaluate the diversion, as you've already mentioned, that can happen when you widen a corridor. You might pull some traffic in from some parallel corridors. So these larger models with the big networks are necessary to help you with that. Then it's usually done to do some sort of a more, you'll hear them called like simulation type models that look at great detail at like the road design elements of the corridor itself to get, you know, a little bit more detail about things like queues that might happen, the effects of ramp meters or whatever it is that's, you know, being contemplated in this corridor from a design perspective. So you sort of need this package of the big picture and the small picture. That's all I kind of want to say, but it is definitely doable.
Thank you so much. That was extremely helpful. All of you. Thanks.
Thank you, Councilor Lewis. It looks like Councilor Rosenthal has his hand up next. Councilor Rosenthal, would you like to ask a question?
Thank you very much. I'm very impressed. This is a great panel with a lot of expertise. I particularly appreciate Kyung-Hwa's comments that no single model can capture the true complexity of the system. My question is fairly practical. As you know, we're sort of in a very interesting experimental period right now. We know that the gasoline prices or petrol prices are really a key factor. People are very sensitive to these, but we also have a great transportation built up demand due to the pandemic. So have the models been used to estimate what the impacts of the increases in gas prices have been, and have they been effective? This is a fairly straightforward question. I'm just wondering if the models are they useful in predicting the future? In other words, how much GHG reductions will we get going forward if the gas prices go up to, for example, European levels, which is about double what we have?
So we can analyze the price go up, but the estimator, let's put it, the propensities, how people reacting to the gas price is estimated before this high price gone high. Just like a pandemic, we didn't know the pandemic coming. Every behavior we observed through the so-called survey, household survey, or transit board, onboard survey types. Those survey guide us to estimate people's propensity, whether I'm gonna take a bus or take a vehicle, or happening this time, that time, going to, you know, Hillsborough or, you know, Gresham or something like that. So all those things is basically past. So your question, whether this model predict correctly with the given information, no. But if we changing that sensitivity to high price, then result going to change it. But we call it unless this is continuing behavior of the market, it will be tailed down. So we're talking about 20 years later, 30 years later, who knows, right? So that's why, again, you know, we often testing those gasoline price, whether going 20% higher or 30% higher. but propensity, whether you're willing to pay or not, is not changing. Just the actual price might go higher or less. That's what we're testing. Does it answer your question?
Councillor Rosenthal, you're muted.
You
It answers at least part of the question. I guess the question is, I mean, can we look to increased petrol prices as helping us in the ability, in our desire to reduce greenhouse gases? In other words, is that going to be a significant factor?
Oh, yes, we can test it. Yeah, we can test it. But my question is back to you. Do you think those things are realistic, will be happen? Nobody knows, right? So that's why we can test it absolutely. And how much it's going to drop, the model can tell you.
We could change it at a policy level, at a national level. We could actually, there are political ways to increase the price of petrol and therefore reduce demand.
Yes.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Is there anybody else who would like to weigh in on this topic, really pricing mechanisms in general as it relates to GHG? Eric Sundquist, you've unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I would just, I'm a fan of models where we're distributing traffic and a skeptic for using models in other ways. I would say that a question like that is kind of maybe more applicable to the route of inquiry that Susan took on induced travel, which is to look at elasticities and just sort of big, there's lots of papers on short and long-term elasticities of travel outcomes from different price changes in gas prices. And, you can then add those into the model as impedances and all this kind of stuff, but you're doing a lot of work that is probably leading to some false precision. My experience with asking the big demand models to answer those sorts of questions is pretty spotty. I'll give you an example. We did work with Massachusetts DOT in my old job, which was the University of Wisconsin. And the current FHWA secretary is director, sorry, was head of MassDOT at the time. And they were arguing internally about the role of pricing and the role of transit and other things in terms of what they would do in terms of VMT. And the modelers kept coming back and saying, well, adding transit does nothing in terms of VMT. And there's reasons, and that's not a crazy thing to say. But she wasn't having it. She said, well, just take all the MBTA transit out of the model. Tell me what happens. Nothing moved. Didn't happen. So the models, again, weren't really set up for all of that. So I would just, I would, you might want to do something that is more literature-based and broad-based as a big scenario rather than trying to come down to the 15th decimal point or something through the model.
And if I can just add to that, there is a lot of research out there and the elasticities are smaller than you might think. In other words, people don't change their behavior as much as we'd like them to when the price changes. And a lot of times that's because they don't have much choice but to drive, so they adapt to the higher price. But Kyung-Hwa also made the important point that if we get really extreme changes, we don't know how it's going to work. All this research is done for the sort of the range of prices that we've had in this country, and if we start talking about a much broader range of prices, we can't be sure that the research that we've got remains valid for that extreme a change. So it's all, it's all guesswork, but it can't hurt us.
Thank you, Professor. And I just want to take this minute to just remind folks that Metro did a regional congestion pricing study that was using scenarios, and we did have to crank the dial. We compared tolling to VMT tax to other tools. You can find that report if you're interested in that online. I can't help but plug our own modeling team on that work. Because I thought it was really good, solid modeling technical work. And I think Councillor Rosenthal's question, it is kind of related to some of our findings in Metro's regional congestion pricing study. So I'm going to pivot. Eric Sabina, I see your hand up, but we're starting to run out of time. So I'm going to hold you for a minute, Eric, and I'm going to call on Councillor Gonzalez. Okay. Counselor Gonzalez, please ask your question.
Thanks, Margie. I know we're short on time and we've had 2 Metro councilors, so I'm wondering if Mayor Callaway has a question, and then I could go after him with remaining time.
Thank you. Thank you for that opportunity to, first of all, great, panel this morning, and I appreciate that it's recording because I know I'm going to watch it again. I am a slow learner, and so thank you for this. Now, a question that I have, where, we are, I guess, reserved, if you will, strategic in terms of some of our freeway widening or expansion. And we have hours of congestion, which does create more greenhouse gases. And so at what point, is there a benefit to, an auxiliary lane or increasing, freeway capacity to lower greenhouse gases? Because as, cars are moving, there's less idling and there's more efficiency with the engine. So I hope that's a quick answer. And thank you, Councilor Gonzalez.
No, very important question. Who would like to go first on that? And we will make time for it. No one wants to weigh in on this. It's the project level kind of analysis in terms of moving cars.
Isn't it that that question should be answered by engineering analysis? So it's more like to be micro simulation along with, that more detailed analysis.
Well, let's talk about that a little bit. I want to dive into that, and I want our panel to weigh in on that. You could run into a conflict if you're looking at your travel demand model over here, and then you're looking at your NEPA analysis, which uses a more granular model at the micro level, and often in Oregon at the NEPA level. So maybe the conversation is, how do you reconcile those things? And I don't want to put words in your mouth, Mayor Callaway. I was just trying to help the panel discussion around this.
Well, it's a trade-off between the traffic flow and the induced travel. So you may be speeding up traffic immediately after construction. And do we ever account for all of the extra emissions that we get because of the extra congestion we get because of construction? But if traffic flow smooths up, yes, those cars may be emitting a little bit less, but you are going to induce additional driving because traffic has speeded up. So you've got to take into account both of those. And there may be some situations where it does make sense from a net change in GHG, but a lot of the analyses do not adequately take into account the induced travel effect. So they're not giving us really a good net assessment of what the effects on GHG will be. Eric probably has more to add to that.
Well, I'm going to try to get other panelists that we haven't heard from since we're kind of getting in. I would maybe call either on Dan from Velope if you want to weigh in on this question, or I know we heard from Colorado DOT that they're doing project level work. Would you like to share a perspective?
I'll just jump in quickly to say that the type models that I mostly work on, the vision eval strategic planning models, aren't suitable for answering this kind of question because they're just at the wrong level.
You're really doing future scenario planning. And Rebecca, what about you and Mayor Callaway's question? Is there a benefit to GHG benefit to moving traffic kind of at the local level? And his example would say, for example, an aux lane to get cars moving.
Yeah, I certainly appreciate the question because like Oregon, Colorado is a rapidly growing state. So we have a whole lot of people moving here and sitting in traffic. And so we are constantly having this dialogue about what we want to be and how we want to move people. I would say it largely depends on the corridor. Right now, we're working on a lot of lane balancing where we have a set of a interstate that has, say, 3 lanes, and then it drops to 2, and then it goes back to 3, and people trying to get up in the mountains. And we think that providing a a solid 3 lanes through that section actually has a lot of benefit for greenhouse gases because we have so much traffic just sitting there. In other corridors, absolutely, we've seen it in some of our interstates in the metro area where we widen and the traffic just comes. It's a little bit better for a little while, like Professor Handy said, and then about 5 years out, we're right back to where we started. Which is why for the most case, when we look at widening, especially in our metro areas, it is always looking at whether we can do it as a managed lane or whether we can get transit on there in some way so we have an option to move people differently. But I'd say it's absolutely the debate and question to have in every single one of these corridors.
And Rebecca, thank you, because I remember from Director Lu's comments at the top of the morning, she was really saying now you're kind of at this state with their goals at GHG that when you do highways expansion, or her specific example, I believe, was bus rapid transit, was becoming a common mitigation for the Colorado DOT.
Absolutely.
Okay, great. Did you get your question answered, Mayor Callaway? Great, thank you for asking. So it's 9:45. I'm going to, Councilor Gonzalez, we're going to take one question from you. And then at 9:50, I just want the panelists to wrap up with some advice for Metro moving forward. So Councilor Gonzalez, please.
Thanks, Margie. Yeah, for sure. I did have a question if I could squeeze it in. So thank you. It's a bit more of a kind of a policy level question, and I'd love to get your perspective on it. You know, as you know, projects and especially mega projects, they tend to take a life of their own at a certain point in time where it just feels like there's so much momentum and you just feed it. It just kind of grows and grows. Either through the, you know, because of a mandate from the legislature or a mandate from, you know, the DOTs and things like that. And yeah, I love all of the different models and you know tools that you presented on today, and I'm wondering from your experience and the work that you've done, are we at a point where this climate modeling as a performance tool has done enough to, you know, significantly change or alter projects across the country, or is it too much of a new thing to really model for, and projects that were going to happen anyway, but maybe they're just a little bit, you know, better because we can measure that improvement? I hope that question makes sense. Basically, it's, you know, now that we're advancing more in climate modeling across the country, how is that impacting projects or stopping projects or changing projects? How are we learning? I guess you could say as a civilization. So it's a bit of a big question there.
Okay, I say Kang-Wha and both Eric Sundquist are eager to answer this question. So go ahead, Kang-Wha.
Yeah, Atlanta Regional Commission, we adopted the project evaluation performance measure as a part of greenhouse gas the performance measure. So every project we analyzing it is we have a quantified greenhouse gas benefit. So you really, maybe we keep saying some of the aspects changing needles at all. I mean, it's very hard to move the needle, but at least we accounting for and understanding it, how impact is, I think it's so beneficial. So either a small project to a larger project, we have this calculation about the greenhouse gas really immensely help to, we can say this is important project. And depending on the, you know, the performance measure, some area really safety is the top priority, or some location is the moving through congestion is, but regardless, I think greenhouse gas has to be there and we really have to measure it, either big picture or a small picture.
Eric Sundquist, would you like to add to that?
Yeah, I would say that the tools, yes, we've talked all about the tools, they're there, and you can do good faith scenario exercises at a metro level. You can do project level stuff. It's all there. It's not perfect, but it's there. But we aren't really doing it on the whole. we're kind of the outliers here on this call. When I was at the University of Wisconsin, I did outreach to state DOTs. There are about 10 of the 51 that are really serious about this, and really, really serious, maybe 4 or 5 of those. Most of the country is not doing this, so there's no outcomes to be had. Where people are looking at it, there are some good outcomes. There is increasing counterweight to that institutional pressure to widen all the time that comes up through these exercises, whether it's technically or politically. So there, I won't, but I could point to a few projects if somebody wanted to follow up later. But it's not for lack of the technical stuff so much, it's the lack of the political will in most places to actually do it.
So your answer is yes, you have seen some of the analysis change the future of our project in certain cases. So
in certain cases, yeah.
Yeah, and so that's a great lead in. We've got 10 minutes left, and what I really want to end with is your lessons learned from Metro or your advice. You've heard from Kim and Taya earlier, kind of where we are. We're headed into a big RTP update. We are exploring these different tools. And so give us your advice, give us your lessons learned as you move forward and any takeaways today. And this panel has been great. So I'm just gonna kind of start, let's see, who are we gonna start with? Maybe I'll start with Dan in terms of your takeaways from today or advice that you have for Metro, and then I'm going to work our way around to the other panelists to wrap up at 10 o'clock.
Sure. Yeah, I'll be brief, but definitely given the interest in induced demand and that project level analysis in combination with trying to understand policy impacts at the region-wide level, you're going to need more than one tool, as you are well aware, and that seems like a really important takeaway from this conversation.
Thank you. That was something that resonated with me. One tool does not do it all. You're going to need multiple tools. Okay, maybe we'll go to a combination of Rebecca and Eric. Sabina next from Colorado DOT. Both feel great to speak up. And I know Colorado, you're in such an interesting place to me because you've got these state laws and you're working through it. So you have to imagine you've got some lesson learned for us, your process.
Yeah, that's probably true. I'll make a couple of remarks and I'm sure Rebecca will want to make some too. From the techies perspective, which is where I've lived on this effort over the last couple of years, I will say that, there are the better modeling tools can really help you in various ways we could, talk about for hours. And there are a lot of opportunities in various regions to go from where they are to a better tool that will really pay dividends. I would, echo the point that Dan made that we need multiple tools, and that's for sure. I would say from the standpoint of the policy people, making sure that you can get some, clear discussions like this one that help you to know what the limitations are, though, the limitations that are still there, where, land use modeling is one we've touched on a lot. So I think that's a big deal. That said, our experience, and I do want to see if Rebecca wants to chime in on this too, but our experience is not to allow yourself to be paralyzed by, what we call, paralysis by lack of perfect analysis, that you can make a lot of progress with good enough numbers and recognizing that you're always going to be doing that. And, you'll make the numbers better into the future, but a lot of the stuff you will have available to you now is good enough to help you move forward. And we have sure done that over the last couple of years. That's been a big lesson for me on this. Rebecca, do you want to add any to that?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, Eric. It's a bit terrifying to kind of step forward, not knowing if the ground's going to be there under you. But otherwise we would have waited for years and continued to study this and debate it and consider it. And we just took the leap. So I think that's really good advice. And the other is just to reiterate something that our executive director said at the top of the hour, just keep the tent broad and the stakeholder group very diverse. We had a lot of folks who were upset with this idea and spent a lot of time talking to them. And I think we've gotten there as a state, but it took some time, and it was a worthwhile effort. And thank you for the invitation today. It's great to hear what's going on in Portland and around the nation.
Thank you so much for being here. I'm going to go to Eric and then Susan, and then have Kang Wei wrap us up at the end. So go ahead, Eric.
Great, thanks. And I also really appreciate being able to be in this dialogue. It's great. Thank you so much. So I really like what Eric said about the paralysis and precision. And I would just only add to that, the lack of precision exists in all of our older tools too. So when somebody spits out a report that says, we're going to add this much capacity to apply to this much volume on a road, and therefore the cars will go this much faster, that's all, that's all very broad as well, right? So it's not like the new stuff we're doing around VMT and GHG is somehow foggier. It's like everything around travel behavior has this issue. And so that leads me to the point I was going to make that kind of goes out of the questions that Councilors Lewis and Callaway asked about, like the effects and the countervailing effects. Given all the uncertainties and lack of precision, I would assume going in that any highway widening will be eaten up by new demand in 5 to 10 years and will have a net increase in both VMT and GHG as a result of that, plus bring back all the congestion and other disamenities that we're worried about. Even in the case where we're maybe getting some cut through traffic out of a neighborhood, if we have overall more VMT, you may end up having more travel through that neighborhood as a result of the just general higher level of driving. Maybe not, but I would make that the starting point and make people advocating for these capacity improvements tell you why it's not true, instead of the way we have done it. And that whole issue of like, well, we just scope out the alternatives and then we kind of do NEPA and then we move forward. Let's make the proof that it's going to end up to be a net benefit stronger, and the assumption, and be more skeptical about that.
Thank you so much. And Susan, advice for Metro, lessons learned.
Yeah, I think just echoing things other people have said. Of course, we do modeling because of statutory requirements. We do modeling because it is helpful to the decision-making process. But these are imperfect tools. And so we never want to lose sight of the limitations of the tools and the very high degree of uncertainty around the numbers that they're spitting out. There's been way too much false precision in our use of modeling historically. But I think the final point I want to make is just that they don't tell us what to do, right? And while I believe that models are helpful to the process, I also am a big believer that we should be deciding what kind of future we want and then working towards that future.
Thank you, Susan. So that's a great takeaway, and it bolsters the need for a scenario planning tool to look at that future. And Kang Wei, please wrap us up with your final thoughts.
Well, first of all, I really appreciate these opportunities. I learned a lot, and I hope everybody else learned, we all as well. When I'm hearing, we all facing same challenges. So as long as we work together, we learn together, not reinventing wheels, and just back to common sense. And as Susan said, let's hope for, what we want to be. And we go, moving toward that, I think we'll do a better job. And not believing model can solve all the issues. We have other tools and other, I think, a policy and techniques can using it. So when we work all together, I think we're gonna make a better region, better society. That's all I can say. And thank you again. Thank you so much.
What a great positive way to end this expert panel review. Thank you so much for your time, your expertise, your resources. I know Metro's 2023 RTP is going to be better because of what we learned today, and whatever, all bunch of staff and stakeholders listening in. So on their behalf as well, thank you very much. We can't see them, but thank you to the audience and thank you to our panels members. Have a great day.